Okay, my last video is on chapter 3. So, for chapter 2, we talked about thought and discussion. Freedom of thought, freedom of discussion. Here we're talking about freedom of action. And so, Mill calls this individuality. So, freedom to choose how we want to live our lives. And this is another piece of utility pleasure, that if we can't do this, we will society, maybe we won't be any less happier, but society will be less happy. So individuality, he says, is a necessary condition for individual human happiness or flourishing and for social progress. It should be encouraged and not suppressed. According to Mill, many of the same reasons for freedom of thought. So the other way of living might be true. Our own way of, we'll come back to that in a minute. What does it mean to call a way of living true? Our own way of life becomes stagnant and dead if it isn't challenged. So we can have dead dogma lives. And our way of life is probably only partially and incompletely true. We need to try other ways of living. Okay, so how can one way of living be true? Well, again, I think Mill means more pleasant. So one way of living may be more pleasant than another. How can we know that? Well, we have to try them both. Okay, so we can't look at other people, maybe other people who take different lifestyles from us, and simply say, well, that's wrong. According to Mill, unless we've tried it, because wrong means that way of life isn't as pleasant as mine. So here he's kind of got us. As long as we're going to use hedonism as our judgment, we can't say one thing is more pleasant than another without having felt the pleasure. We may have another way of arguing at this, but then we're looking at things very differently from the way Mill looks at them. A way of living is true or better if it involves qualitatively better pleasure. So the pig's life, says Mill, is not as good as Socrates' life. Remember that quote. So some of the things we want to do when we're trying to be individuals. We want to choose our own plan for ourselves. We want to have strong impulses and creative energy. We need to be willing to go against mass mediocrity, not motivated by authority, and be original and creative. Compare this to Socrates. Some of these might describe Socrates, but a lot of these things describe more what we might consider an artist, a bohemian type personality. Okay, maybe he might be thinking of someone like Richard Wagner, if you look up Wagner's life and the sort of way that Wagner lived his life. Andy Warhol is another example that might fit this bill. The value to the individual is it makes the most of our unique abilities. It's active rather than a passive use of our strength. It creates fullness of life, and it gives us character. Okay, ignore those page numbers. Those are they're from the book I had you buy if you bought the book. But what's the utilitarian value? Well, society does not value individuality for its own sake. It is not valuable in its own right. Morally, we should strive for a better, superior society. In the long term, individuality is valued as a means to that. So I think people in our society, people who advocate different lifestyles, would probably be upset at this because they want their lifestyles to be valued for their own sake. Whereas Mill would say, I don't value that for its own sake. Do whatever you want to do. Okay? What I value for it is that we have a better society when we have all these different ways of living being lived. So I think he probably would be upset about prosecuting cake makers who don't want to accept a certain way of lifestyle. It's not about accepting it, it's about having it, according to Mill. So individuality may actually do nothing for us. We may even find it annoying, but it's still a social good. So we're trying to get this thing in our mind now, okay? It produces a better society. Quote, originality is the one thing which unoriginal minds cannot feel the use of. They cannot see what it is to do for them. How should they? If they could see what it would do for them, it would not be originality. I think he's got us there. So there. So next time maybe you feel compelled to condemn certain people for what they're doing. Try to look at it from Mill's point of view and try to take it. It's not about whether they're right or they're wrong. It's about whether our society's better off having many different ways of living in our society. And you might maintain that as a for social reasons, even though you might think morally some of these things might be wrong. And I don't know what you think about that. Okay, the last thing to talk about here is the harm principle, which is the next video.